I went for the lights. It sounds prettier than the truth. What I meant that evening was the way the chandeliers softened everyone's edges, the way the gilded mirrors promised a reflection of success rather than the private ache that lived behind my teeth. The gala was a geometry of faces, strategic smiles, practiced grief, people angling for favors as if conversation were currency. I wore a gown that learned to move like a practiced apology. I smiled. I gave the right names for the right causes. I answered because that is what people in my world do. They perform concern until it feels like charity. Outside, the rain had a different economy. It didn't care for overlays of silk and glass. It came hard and honest, flattening the night into a smear of headlights and umbrellas. The valet kept his distance from the puddled curb. Mostly we kept distance from one another too. I had come to the event as an act of duty and left it as an act of survival. He was there, not in the ballroom but at the place where the night narrowed, a curb that smelled of wet asphalt and perfume. He didn't move like a man making an entrance. He moved like someone who had learned not to announce himself, like a shadow that had been given permission to own the shape it took up in the world. When he stepped under the awning, water sliding off his shoulders, the air changed. The women adjusted their clutch purses. A man standing too close straightened his back without thinking. He looked at me the way you might study a photograph and not yet understand the margins. His face bore a scar that drew a line from cheek to jaw, like a seam sewn hurriedly and not entirely closed. The scar made his profile a map of some prior violence. But what made him interesting in that rainlit doorway wasn't the scar. It was the steadiness in his gaze, a kind of patient accounting of what he saw. "You look like you could use a dry place," he said. It was not a question. I told myself I should refuse. I could have waited for my driver to appear, for a polite escort from the event staff, for the familiar choreography of arrivals and departures. Instead, I accepted an umbrella that smelled faintly of tobacco and rosemary, and let him close the space between us the way people sometimes close windows against a draft. Because it's warmer on the other side. He didn't offer a hand. He offered an observation. "You shouldn't go out that way." The inflection was interesting. It was neither overbearing nor solicitous. It implied a category that had nothing to do with stations or favors. It belonged to a different ledger entirely, concern laid down as fact. There are a dozen ways to decline, to call a cab, to flag a friend. There are a dozen ways to keep the narrative of your life intact. I considered them all for the time it takes your pulse to align with an irregular beat. And then I made a calculation that surprised me. Leaving with him was, in that slate moment, the most practical way to preserve dignity. The crowd had eyes and the headlines have teeth. To go home dripping, arm in arm with a man whose presence would later be described by some reporter as mysterious, was to enter a gossip machine that I have learned can turn kindness into scandal. So I decided to leave with him. Not out of a romantic flicker, but because it was a safer bet than standing under an awning while the night catalogued me. I accepted the offer because for once, someone had stripped the social script down to a bare choice and put it back to me. Stay exposed to the room or walk away into something unknown. We did not exchange names then. Names have weight. They can attach a person to the world in ways that make leaving more complicated. I wanted only the practical warmth of the dry platform he offered. By the time his car eased away from the curb, the Gala shrinked into a rectangle of light receding behind us. Rain peppered the windows. The city moved as a thumping blur. He drove with the sort of quiet that insists on being noticed only when it stops. When he finally spoke, the words landed like measured stones. "There's a place nearby," he said. "You can be dry there for a little while, no obligations. I'm not interested in the party." He said the last part with something almost like apology, but the apology belonged to the party and not to him. I understood, in a pragmatic pulse, that what he offered was not intimacy in the public sense. No introductions, no photographs, no buzz of voices. It was a week of logic. Remove the optics, reduce the risk. There was no sentimental promise in it. There was an implicit contract of a different sort. He framed his offer as protection, but it was not protection in the hollow sense that could be bought with badges or subtitles. It felt like containment, something that would isolate me from the heat of immediate attention. For someone who has learned to live in the crosshairs of reputation, isolation can be a kind of relief. I asked him, without theatrics, what the cost was. If this was some mercenary kind of shelter, I would have refused. I am not in the business of being owed. He gave an almost rueful smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "There are rules." "That's acceptable," I said. In that moment, negotiating felt like my native language. If there were rules, I would learn them. I always learned the rules for anything I entered. We arrived at his house after midnight, when the rain had narrowed to a hush and the city had forgotten us. From outside, the estate looked like a block of night quiet. Tall hedges, a gate that could be opened with the right hand and hairpin logic. The lights along the drive illuminated the way like the edges of a stage set. Inside, the house smelled of smoked wood and coffee and something floral. An old person's scent given new life. Rosa met us in the hall. She is the kind of woman whose hands announce her. Knuckles softened by labor, nails short, fingers that have rehearsed holding a million small domestic mercies. She nodded as if she'd been waiting for someone to arrive who was not yet entirely settled. Her eyes moved over me with the precise economy of a housekeeper who also functions as moral assessor. There is a discipline to Rosa's glance. It could register a dress that needed mending or a life that needed rearranging, and she did not conflate the two. Behind her was Marco, a man whose posture spoke of spatial competence. He performed the room the way a well-trained animal performs a recall, attentively, without over-enthusiasm. He watched the doorways and corners in a way that suggested his understanding of threat was practical. He didn't ask questions. He catalogued. Dante's house is not a museum of wealth. It is a machine that looks like a home. The living room had a sofa that accepted a body without asking its credentials. The windows opened onto a garden that held itself like a secret. There were books on a low table, an ashtray that had been used the same amount as something that has been lit and then put away. Neither ritual nor neglect, only habit. It did not feel like a trap. It felt like a place that had been prepared for arrivals who might need something unnamed. Which is a different calculus from a house prepared for guests. He led me into a room with the sort of muted light that makes secrets feel less immediate. I could see, stacked along a console, a set of screens. They were not the glinting, dramatic monitors of a surveillance thriller. They were domestic, black rectangles that drank the light and returned a small, grainy truth. On them, the edges of the garden came into view in faint slices. A camera lens's remembrance of a hedge, the way gravel shifts when someone crosses it. I didn't move to read anything. The monitors had the effect of making the house breathe in a measured cadence, like a body that has learned to expect interruptions. He watched me watch them. "You noticed," he said. Yes. I had noticed. I had noticed the way power is exercised in subtle domestic forms. The placement of cameras like the placement of staff, the way a door can be made harder to open and thereby less inviting. I am not naive about visibility. Having lived in the peripheries of headlines, I have learned to regard sightlines as policy. "What are the rules?" I asked, because that is what I asked of every man and every plan that proposed to interfere with my autonomy. He answered in a way that felt simultaneously candid and rehearsed. He told me he would offer shelter for a finite time, that he had people who performed certain functions, logistics, attention, quiet, and that this was not an imposition without oversight. He added, delicately, that his ways were sometimes unconventional. He did not qualify with details, and I did not ask for them. There are certain kinds of detail that commit you. There are others you allow to remain suggestive. I set conditions. I have always been good at setting terms when the ledger of my life is in question. I told him in a tone that was just neutral enough to be heard as business. No monitoring without consent, no action taken in my name, the ability to leave at will. The return of my privacy when I wanted it, a limitation on who could enter my room without my explicit permission. I set them out like currency, and I watched his face as if he might write them down and take them for collateral. He listened. He did not bargain. He listened as if he were learning the shape of an argument he would later accept. This, for me, was crucial. If someone wants to offer safety, I will accept it only on my terms. Safety that comes wrapped in the erasure of agency is not safety at all. He accepted the week. It wasn't a man's vow. It was an arrangement. He would shelter me for 7 days. No more. We would take the mediation of the week to figure out the fallout. He would not act in my name. He agreed, and in agreeing he made his own kind of submission to the parameters I had set. That admission, that he would respect limits, was a small victory that mattered more than the grandeur of his house. There are people who think that to accept help is to be indebted. I do not live in that economy. I accepted what was offered because I assessed the balance of risks and decided that a week of contained exposure was a better route than the slow unraveling that public attention can cause. I am accustomed to being careful with how I tally what I accept. That night the house moved around me like a slow animal. Rosa placed a cup of tea in my hands as if she had been doing so for years, though I was a new guest in her world. Marco cleared a chair and folded a throw as if to say the room would remember me for being here, and then not. Dante sat across from me and kept the conversation to the level of the practical, of the weather, of the night. We spoke in fragments, like people who are testing the distance between confession and performance. When he finally talked about why he had a house that watched its edges, he spoke of a mother. The story came in the way the most dangerous confessions come: shocked, small, precise. He said his mother had been struck at a bus stop, little more than a figure blurred into the texture of the city. He said he had been 7 the day it happened. He had watched her fold like a rag into the street and had learned the shape of impotence in a single night. That memory, being a child while an adult world failed someone he loved, built a logic for him. It wasn't the action itself that followed. It was the philosophy. He wanted to see. He wanted to know the edges of a problem in order to respond. I do not excuse grief that becomes violence. Grief can contort into something that mistakes possession for protection. But to hear him speak of his mother was to see why he had made a life where being prepared felt like the only moral currency that mattered. He did not romanticize the deeds that followed. He described them with a kind of tired ownership, as if he carried the ledger of them in his pocket and could not yet reconcile the sum. I listened, and, in listening, I calibrated the weight I would allow him to carry in my life. I insisted on transparency. Any past act that could implicate me or endanger someone else had to be rendered to the right authorities. I required documentation about who in his orbit bore what responsibilities. I demanded that any future action he intended to take on my behalf had to be cleared with me first. My voice in that room was not shrill. It was precise and final in the way of someone who knows the costs of loopholes. He agreed. The agreement was small, and therefore durable. We negotiated a few more details. Marco would be the point person for any logistical decisions. Rosa would remain the moral center of the house, unseen but present. There would be a schedule for my movements if that made me comfortable. Times to be driven to certain short trips, to maintain appearances in a way that did not expose me. I insisted on a clause. If anyone proposed action that would involve injury, harm, or anything that carried criminal exposure, the decision would be made only with my consent and with legal counsel present if necessary. He did not like the clause, and that was significant. He did not like that the world had become complex enough that his impulses required consent forms. But he accepted it. It mattered that he accepted it. We spent the early hours talking in a manner that felt like diplomacy more than romance. Yet there were moments, small, soft, that read like something else. The way he would hand me the cup of tea. The way he softened the inflection of his voice when he described an adult tenderness he had once known. Those small courtesies did not become proofs. They were simply evidence of human habit. I slept in a guest room that night and woke with the sense that someone had rearranged the furniture of my life without consulting me. That sense was not only discomfort, it was the precise temperature of any compromise between privacy and protection. The monitors at the edges of the property watched the garden. I knew this, and I knew enough to understand what that watching implied. I also knew enough to remember that I had made my own choice. The monitoring existed by my consent. I had the power to revoke it. Yet the presence of those screens created a new interiority I hadn't expected. It made me feel less alone and simultaneously less free. It was as if the house had acquired eyes that made the world outside legible, but those eyes had weight. They could, in an instant, be used to justify action. That possibility made my agreement with him feel like a knife balanced on a scale, effective only so long as both parties held their hands steady. Over the next day, the world tried to find me. My phone lit with messages from colleagues who understood no nuance beyond the social snapshot. The tabloids, always hungry for the smallest pry, circled at a remove. The benefit of hiding becomes its own risk. It suggests there is something to hide. A rumor can be a flame or a moth around one. I did not want to provide fuel. I wanted to extinguish the spark. The week would be a time-limited shelter from that hunger. Rosa moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who carries a household in her head. She set down coffee in the morning like a peace offering. Her hands made the morning functional. Marco kept a presence at the perimeters that was not performative. It was practical. Dante continued to show me the edges of his life in fragments, letters he'd kept, a photograph of a woman who smiled as if someone had promised the world to her. He did not ask for my immediate intimacy. He did not demand more than I chose to give. Still, something shifted. There were small incursions, almost imperceptible. A door left unlocked overnight that I had explicitly asked to be latched. A camera pointed in a direction I had not sanctioned. A message he left unsent in the phone I found on a side table. Each transgression alone might have been a slip. Together they created a pattern, and patterns have implications. Patterns are the grammar of intention. I called him out on them in a way that surprised me. I remember the sentence as if it were a coin I had spent. You can keep me safe without keeping me hostage. He winced, which was rare for him. He was not used to being told the limits of his own generosity. Protection looks like a lot of things, he said. It was not an admission, more a recognition that language has breadth. Not if it's carried out of my control, I said. Not if the people who work for you begin to decide my movements without my consent. That's not shelter. That's power. He nodded, slow. The house seemed to be listening. Rosa paused in the doorway, as if she had heard the texture of the argument and would catalog it later. Marco didn't speak. He had the kind of face that can take in a reprimand without making it his own. Dante set down his cup and regarded me with a look that was neither apologetic nor defiant. It was appraising, as if he were measuring whether my terms would erode his operational instincts. I will not cross the line without your say-so, he told me. I promise you that. Promises are fragile, but they matter. In a week we can see what promises are made of. We agreed, finally, to a simple device. Every day he would hand me a ledger of activities, entries of who visited, what had been seen on the cameras, any notes on incidents. It would be my record to review. He reacted to the suggestion with something like surprise. Habits of secrecy do not always appreciate sunlight. But he accepted it. That acceptance was another small victory. When you are the kind of woman who has had to build institutions to make corporations feel human, you learn that symbolic gestures matter as much as the law. I asked for structural things, receipts for any work done, a clear chain of command should any action be contemplated, an outside counsel we could both agree upon. I demanded an audit trail, because transparency is the kind of weapon that cuts cleanly and leaves less blood than secrecy. He did not like the formality of it. He showed me, instead, a photograph of his mother tucked into an old book, and admitted, without his usual armor, that history sometimes instructs and sometimes haunts. For the first few days, the house operated like an organism finding a new rhythm. I learned the routes the staff took across the floors. I learned that Rosa kept the salt in a particular jar, and that Marco preferred his coffee black, no sugar. Small details made the place less an institution and more a home, but with edges. I found that I could occupy it deliberately, that within the constraints I had set I could carve a private geography. There were moments of strange tenderness. A late-night conversation on the back porch about ordinary things. Books we'd read, trivial childhood embarrassments, softened what at the outset might have been only a practical arrangement. I am not immune to gentleness. It is not a weakness to appreciate kindness when it appears, but kindness did not equal surrender. Everything in the house was transactional in the way that people in power arrangements often are. Gestures meant to balance liabilities. Each kindness was an offering and not an obligation. And then, a small test. A driver came in the wind with a story. A delivery at the gate. Someone who said his name and meant to pass. He was kept at the entrance until his reason could be verified. The house held. Visibility became a defense. Marco walked the perimeter on the pretext of a check and came back with a frown. He said nothing at first. Rosa brewed another pot of coffee. Dante folded his hands and watched the wall. That evening, as rain began again, I found myself watching the monitors not as a curious guest, but as an active participant in the terms I had set. I traced the edges of the screen with my eyes, and felt both a shiver of security and an echo of constraint. The monitors were a reminder that my world had become both safer and smaller. I had accepted a week. I had insisted on terms. He had agreed. But the ethics of shelter are messy. The offer of refuge, however sincere, creates dependencies. Those dependencies have a habit of revealing the electrified seams beneath civility. I knew this because I had built institutions and watched them budge unpredictably under pressure. I also knew it because I had lived long enough to see how good intentions often find their way into dangerous practices. The next morning, a headline flickered on my phone, a rumor about my disappearance that had become an insinuation. Someone had taken a photograph outside the house's gate. It was grainy, a shadow with a familiar silhouette. The tabloids can do more with a smear than a biography can do with a life. The journalist's pen is a kind of hunger that needs feeding. I called Dante. He answered with the composure of someone who had been awake for this moment before. "We'll handle it," he said. "Handle it how?" I asked, the ledger of my life suddenly feeling weightless when it should have felt ironclad. "We'll control the narrative," he said. "We'll make sure the right voices—" "No," I said. My voice surprised me with its sharpness. "You don't control my narrative? I do. You can make suggestions, you can offer help, but you don't take my voice away." He was quiet, and in that silence there was negotiation. Rosa overheard from the kitchen and did not comment. Marco's presence was steady on the other side of the house. The watchful screens were not passive anymore. They were instruments that could be interpreted. "I'll get you access to the right counsel," he said at last, a line I had insisted on earlier. "We'll manage what we must legally." It was not the same as erasing the photograph, but there is a difference between calming the fever and rewriting history. He understood that. I could see it in the line of his jaw and the slow set of his shoulder. He had friends who could move things. That had always been part of his utility. But he had also agreed to limits. The trouble with good men who know how to act is that they often believe the ends justify the means. Outside, the rain eased into a hush. Inside, the house continued its quiet choreography. I lay awake that night wondering about boundaries, about how much autonomy one truly has when a shelter is offered by someone who can, in practice, reorder the world. There is a seduction in power, just as there is relief in safety. Those two forces rub together in ways that make moral clarity a rare commodity. The week stretched before me like a taut fabric. It promised shelter, analysis, and perhaps, if things were done properly, some degree of mitigation. I had made demands and received commitments. He had told me fragments of his past that explained more than they excused. Rosa and Marco occupied their stations like pillars of an argument. I slept with a small socket of unease that felt not like fear, but like anticipation. When dawn came with a thin light, he placed something in my hand. A small, ordinary key on a thin chain. It was not garish. It was not a ring of promise. It was simple and cool against my palm. "This," he said, "is for your room. You keep it." I looked at the key. In the house, keys were both literal and symbolic, the mechanism by which doors could be asserted closed. I admired the gesture and was wary of its grammar. A key can be a token of trust or a reminder of possession, depending on who holds it and under what conditions. "I will keep it," I said. And I meant it. If only because I wanted to test whether this tender would remain a token of choice rather than a token of ownership. I threaded the chain around my neck because I wanted the weight of it where I could feel it. A daily check on consent. He watched me fasten the chain and did not comment. The gesture was meaningful and ambiguous all at once. The key was mine by design and by decision. It would be a talisman of the weak, and perhaps of something longer. But the meaning of talismans is assigned by the person who wears them. The day unfolded with the banalities of a household that was simultaneously a sanctuary and a stage. I determined to use the week not merely to hide but to build something that would survive the dust of headlines. A plan, perhaps, or an institution, or a foundation. Something that extracted meaning from the peril of that night. I am not a woman who lets crisis be an anecdote. I make it a thesis. The house watched in its quiet way. The monitors held their grainy view of the hedges, the driveway, the road. I could see the small anomalies in the footage without understanding all the consequences. But I had given myself power. The ability to review entries, to demand disclosures, to deny action that implicated me in harm. Those were not glamorous rights, but they were rights nonetheless. And then, on the third night, someone knocked at the back gate. It was a sound that was both ordinary and too close. The house woke itself. Lights flared in hallways like breath drawn quick. Marco moved before anyone said anything. Rosa stood with a towel like an imprint of domestic order. Dante came to the window and watched the line of the garden as if it had become a choice in front of him. I stood at the center of the storm of action, and for the first time since the curb, felt the pure hinge of decision. To step into someone else's fight or to exercise the prerogative I had insisted upon when I arrived. To keep my autonomy and hold people accountable to the law. I did not yet know which way I would lean. But I had the key around my neck, warm against my skin, steady with my breath. The week I had accepted had been purchased with a price that would reveal itself in choices yet to be made. The monitors flickered. The garden hummed with someone's breath. And inside all of us a small strategy was taking shape that would test promises and expose the truth of character. If you like compact stories that live in the gray between desire and duty, stay with me. There's more to this week than shelter. There are bargains, tests, and a ledger that will not close easily. The knock at the back gate arrived like a punctuation in a paragraph that had been running too long. It carried the ordinary weight of someone testing a door. 3 blunt beats that said, "I am outside." But the house read it as a question it had been waiting to answer. Lights along the path brightened as if in reflex. Rosa paused mid-step. Marco's hand tightened on the banister like a man hearing his name called from the dark. We moved like a single organism trained for these moments. Marco reached the gate first, his body a silhouette that filled the small window where the garden met the night. The grainy feed on the monitor showed him through a little prism of green hedgerow and sodium light. For a moment my own eyes betrayed me. I saw an angle of shoulder and a flash of someone's coat and wanted the scene to mean nothing more than a misdelivered package. The house had been taught to hope for small things. Marco opened the gate a sliver. I watched him through the living room doorway, tea forgotten in my hand. He spoke in a flat voice I could not quite hear from where I stood, and then, because the house is always an economy of small noises, there was a rapid exchange at the threshold. The low sheen mutter of a voice insisting something. The brusque answer of someone being told to wait. The clink of metal. The man at the gate, if man was how the tabloid would later call him, had a posture that suggested need and menace in equal measure. He smelled faintly of wet leather and the river. He held his head low in a way that made me think of apologies owed and apologies not given. Marco's hand rested near his hip. It was the kind of position trained to dissuade and to answer all at once. I told myself I would watch, that I had the power to stop what might follow, because I had insisted on limits here. The key at my throat felt like a steady metronome against my pulse. The exchange stretched. A few words, too fast for my ears, fell from one to the other. Then there was a movement I did not expect. The stranger stepped back as if pushed, or as if the gravel under his feet had betrayed him. He turned, reached into a pocket, and something small and metallic caught the porch light. The world narrowed in the way it does when a single salient thing refocuses a room. A wrist, the reflection of metal, the sound of a single shot, then the animal panic of motion. I will not describe technicalities. I will not lay out procedures that belong to those who act with weapons. That is neither my place nor the texture I want for memory. What I can tell you is the way sound changes the body. The single report, an explosion that somehow seems both thunder and a dry, close pop, made the house inhale. Mirrors trembled. Rosa dropped the cup she had been carrying, and it shattered into a dozen polite apologies. Marco moved like someone who has already rehearsed his response in 1,000 previous quieter scenarios. Dante was at the window before I realized he had stood, his face a carved thing in the lamplight. Then there was a man collapsed on the gravel, a shape that did not belong to the architecture of the garden. I heard footsteps from the road, a car engine skidding, and then a second, distant crack. The world reduced into a series of immediate practicalities. Who was hurt? Who could breathe? Where was the nearest call for help? Rosa was the first to run, not with the adrenaline of the young, but with the force of a woman who knows how to hold a body and a house at the same time. She was over the threshold in 2 strides, her hands already cupping where someone bled. Marco knelt, his motion economical and without ceremony, and I saw on his hand, on the knuckles I had noticed before, the tremor of a man who had been asked to do more than keep the perimeter. I went to the windowsill and then, as if in a demonstration of the very agency I had insisted upon when I arrived, stepped toward the doorway. My voice cut across the chaos, precise and small. "Call the police. Stay with him. Someone call an ambulance. No one moves anything until the authorities arrive." Dante moved faster than his habit of slow observation suggested. He was at the fallen man before I could process the mechanics of the motion. The scent of smoke, hot iron, cordite, hung in the air and made my eyes sting. For a moment, he bent and touched the stranger in a way that looked almost private. Then he straightened. His shirt had collected a smear of mud from the gravel, a mark that would later be photographed and used as evidence. He had a thin film of moisture on his lip, as if he had been holding his breath. "Is he okay?" I asked. "No," Marco said. "He's been shot. We need an ambulance." Rosa's fingers were busy. She was calm in the only way that can be learned, from having been in rooms where consequences were immediate. Her voice was a low catalogue, where he'd been struck, whether he had responded, what color his lips had. It was terrible and efficient, mothering in a context I had not invited. When the first officers arrived, the garden resembled a stage left in the midst of a play. The hedges looked greener under the harsh lights, the gravel more oppressive. I told the truth to the first uniform that asked my name. My voice was flat as a ledger entry. I said where I had been, who I had been with, and reiterated the insistence I had set down in the house. No acts would be taken in my name without my consent. The officer's flashlight traced the path from the gate to the car. There were reporters across the street, the kind who treat the circumference of tragedy like a hunting ground. A reporter managed to get a single, grainy photograph of someone on a stretcher before the paramedics drew their screens, and the scene was contained. In the hospital's waiting room, the anxiety became administrative. Statements were taken in a kind of rhythm, a recitation of facts and sequences that felt colder than the sting I had just lived through. I found myself insisting, again and again, on legal counsel for Dante before any interviews that might incriminate him. That was a clause I had inserted in our fragile week-long charter, and I meant to see it exercised now. The man in the gravel survived the night. He would bear a wound that would scar him in ways both material and reputational. He would speak later to investigators with a version of the events that only he could fully own. For me, the immediate moral knot was that something I had consented to, the shelter, was now implicated in harm. I felt like a woman who had signed a lease and then watched the roof cave in. Dante called me the next morning in a voice that had been carved down to its base. He told me, quietly, that he was going to hand himself in. If I tell you that the decision startled me, I am understating how profoundly it shifted the geometry between us. I had insisted since the beginning that there be consequences for actions taken on my behalf. I had demanded transparency. I had required the hand of law to be involved where harm had occurred. Now he offered the most difficult kind of compliance. He would not wait for the officers to come find him. He would go to the district attorney and render himself. There are many ways to be brave. There are fewer ways to be moral, properly considered. Moral in the sense of being willing to see one's actions measured by public institutions, to accept inquiry, and to risk penalty. Dante's move was not a clearing of his slate. It was a step into a process that would not absolve him by his own volition. He walked into the DA's office with the air of a man bearing a weight too public for him to have previously acknowledged. He gave himself up in a statement that restrained confession to fact and did not dramatize motive. He handed over pieces of evidence, ledgers, notes, a thumb drive whose contents would be analyzed. He admitted that men who had worked for him had been present at the gate that night, and that the decision to engage had been made in pressure and in habit, rather than through the careful approval I had insisted upon. He told investigators things that were small and fatal. Names, locations, and a pattern of practices that, when traced back, read like modes of action rather than isolated acts. I watched the process with that strange double vision that comes when an event is both personal and civic. On the one hand, there was the private calculus, my relationship to this man, the moments of tenderness in a household that had sheltered me. On the other hand, institutions moved like tidal forces, subpoenas, interviews, the DA's team, and a careful unspooling of legal consequences. I insisted the house's video logs be turned over to authorities. Dante did so. He did not attempt to sanitize the feed. He handed it to the DA's office with the same bounded solemnity with which he had accepted my ledger system. That was one of the first signs, after the initial shock, that he was prepared to accept structures outside of his reach. But structures exact price. They demanded naming, accounting, and public record. The man's wound required an explanation and someone to be held to account. Marco offered a statement. He recounted how the man had approached the gate, how the exchange had escalated, how a weapon had been produced. There were choices in how to frame those minutes. Was there an attempt at theft, an ambush, an act of violence unrelated to me? The DA's office would have to determine whether the defense of the property and the life of the house was proportionate and whether the chain of command had been lawful. Those are the disciplines that separate private expediency from public justice. The tabloids predicted a narrative they desired. A socialite, an anti-hero, a bloody confrontation. The papers wrote frames that liked the line of my dress against a tableau of violence. They tried to romanticize the edges. I refused to let my public image be used as currency in a story I was still living. I demanded that reports include the facts we could prove. That insistence, my insistence, would be tested repeatedly, by press conferences, by leaks, by the way lawyers argued over how pieces of footage might be edited to create meaning. I found myself using the same institutional literacy that had built my life, calling counsel, organizing records, insisting on depositions and transparency. Dante did not pretend he had been blameless. He admitted that the men in his employ had a habit of anticipating danger and meeting it preemptively. He gave up artifacts of that life. Notebooks where names were circled, lists of people to be watched. The DA's office had to determine whether those habits had crossed the line into criminal behavior. There were counts that might be brought, charges to consider. Assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, unlawful surveillance. I will not presume the will of a court, but I can say with the clarity of the moment, Dante's decision to submit himself changed the tenor of the inquiry. It did not erase the harm. It made sure that the harm would not be privatized someone else's burden. There were hearings that bled into weeks. The DA's team took statements from the man in the gravel, from Marco, from Rosa, from the paramedics. Experts weighed in on whether the use of force had been justified. My role in those weeks was not passive. I insisted on transparency and on institutional remedies beyond whatever penal measures might be exacted. I made clear, again and again, that my acceptance of shelter was not a transfer of moral responsibility. My voice in legal rooms was firm. If there were to be public trust restored, it would not be restored by private apology alone. The house and the men who worked within it had to submit to oversight. Dante listened. He had been raised in a world where acts were paid for by silence and the efficient removal of problems. I had asked that that ledger be opened so that the accounts could be balanced under law. He did it, and the cost was visible in his face. He had not expected prosecution. He had expected the possibility of a negotiated internal accounting. The DA's office had no interest in private settlements for acts that carried public harm. If a man is wounded on gravel, the state has a stake in learning whether that wound was inflicted by a criminal miscalculation or by a lawful defense. This was not a philosophical musing. It was the scaffolding of lived consequence. The legal process produced, in time, a set of outcomes that were messy and consequential. Dante faced charges, some dropped, some proceeding. He accepted a plea that included a period of supervised accountability, community service within the system of oversight he had resisted, and the relinquishment of certain assets to be held in a trust that I insisted would be governed by an independent board. He agreed to disclose the house's records fully to authorities, and to cooperate in the reform of certain surveillance practices that had been a feature of his life. His lawyers argued for mitigation. The DA's office negotiated terms that held him to account, while acknowledging his cooperation. The courtroom did not absolve him, and neither did it feed him a narrative of martyrdom. He paid fines, he attended mandated interventions, and, crucially, he agreed to structural reforms rather than private settlements alone. I insisted on building more than punishment. Punishment is an instrument of consequence. Repair is a program of work. The week I had accepted as shelter became, in my thinking, the seed of something larger. An institution that could provide legitimate, law-abiding protection for people endangered by public exposure. a program that favored audits, training, legal counsel, and the kind of transparency that makes abuse harder to hide. It would not be a way to protect private interests by avoiding civic accountability. It would be a mechanism that partnered with law enforcement and communities to restore safety without allowing private men to write the rules. The foundation I set up bore a name that was careful and not showy. We built a board of people I trusted, some from my world and some from outside it. Rosa protested modestly at the paperwork. Marco took an unpaid leave at first, then found work in a training program that taught others about de-escalation within the law. Dante agreed to fund an independent audit of the security practices around his properties and to place certain surveillance data under the control of an external custodian. He handed over drives of footage and lists and allowed legal teams to walk them through. There would be no more anonymous files kept without oversight. His cooperation dented the wall of secrecy, but did not mend every wound. There were those who accused me of laundering his image by marrying my institutional capital to his funds. There were others who said I had been naive in accepting shelter in the first place. Both critiques had grains of truth. I had accepted help from a man whose habits had once been set by a grief that calcified into modes of prevention. I had not and would not sanitize that devotion. Instead, I turned it into labor. Audits, trainings, legal procedures, grants to communities that had no access to private security. It was redemption, of a sort, enacted in public and under law, rather than offered as apology in the dark. The days after the shooting were also personal accountability for me. I had to reconcile my choice to leave the Gala with the tangible harm that had been wrought. I had to accept that my actions, my decisions for survival in that small moment of rain and glare, had made demands of others. That truth was humbling. It sharpened my capacity for demands. If I asked men to step into action on my behalf, I would demand that such action be accountable, transparent, and, above all, consented to. I continued to wear the key against my chest, not as a talisman of possession, but as a token of that insistence. It reminded me daily that a shelter can be a covenant only when both parties choose to be bound by law. Dante's time under public scrutiny altered him. It did not make him gentle. There are people whose habits of control do not give way overnight. What changed was not his muscularity of action, but the architecture of constraint around him. He learned to accept audits, to meet with counsel, to attend programs where men were taught accountability instead of secrecy. He gave financially to the foundation we built with the caveat that the money be held in trust and subject to independent governance. This was no theatrical act. It was a painful unlearning of muscle memory that had led him to act outside civic processes. Marco's own path was complicated. He had always been someone whose loyalty was a fact rather than a philosophy. He loved the house, the rhythms, the chores, the certainty of a plan. The incident unmoored him. He was questioned about the moment when the weapon was produced. He testified plainly about the sequence. There were consequences in the sense of reputational disruption, and a shaft of legal limelight that fell on him, but he was not prosecuted in the way that Dante might have been, had evidence tied him to a premeditated escalation. Instead, he became an unofficial partner in retraining programs, teaching men how to hold perimeters, without making the law an afterthought. Rosa refused to be relegated to the background. She served on the Foundation's ethics committee. Her domestic intelligence transformed into governance muscle that would hold our work to practical standards. There were moments where I questioned whether any of this, boards, audits, foundations, could truly wash the immediate physics of that night. It could not change a bruise or erase the smell of smoke. It could, however, create mechanisms so that such a night was less likely to be repeated. That seemed worth the labor. It was better than sentiment, and safer than silence. The weeks turned into months. There were small domestic scenes, administrative meetings over coffee at Rosa's kitchen table, late-night calls with lawyers, visits to clinics where community members learned about safety plans that respected autonomy. There were also gestures that mattered because they were human and not institutional. Marco learning to hand me a mug without the posture of a man who expects an order. Rosa bringing me a scarf she had knitted and refusing any payment. Dante sitting with me on the porch without attempting to fill every silence. Rebuilding trust is a series of tests, none of them decisive, none of them permanent. I allowed small intimacies and maintained my contracts. We added a clause to the Foundation's charter. Any security plan funded or endorsed by the foundation would require an independent counsel's sign-off and the consent of the person being protected. It was a small legal mechanism that had been born out of a simple moral insistence. Consent remains a standing, revocable condition. One ordinary afternoon, one of those days where the sun moves through rooms and the house smells faintly of rosemary from the kitchen, I asked Dante to hand me something. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a small brass key on a simple chain. I still had my own key. He offered this one with a motion that was both private and formal. "This one is for the foundation's safe," he said. "It's symbolic. You can keep mine until the board assigns solicitors and we have independent custody procedures in place." I looked at the key in his palm. We had both learned that keys could be claims of possession or instruments of access. This key, in his hand, was neither a surrender nor a claim of ownership. It was a test of trustworthiness. He placed it in my palm with a simplicity that had nothing to do with ceremony. There was no cinematic music. There was instead a thin sense of gravity. "I'll hold it," I said. "But the safe will have 2 keys. The board will have a member with authority to sign for releases." It was practically a contractualization of intimacy, turning a gesture into a governance mechanism. He nodded. It was the sort of small arrangement that did more than a vow. It created accountability in a space where habit and habit's consequences had once mingled dangerously. We did not marry our lives in any tidy sense. There was no sudden fusion of calendars or public pronouncements of forever. There was, instead, a negotiated geography. Times for meetings, times for separation, a structure for when the cameras would be active and whose permission was required to view footage. The key around my neck remained an emblem of the bargain. I had chosen shelter for pragmatic reasons. Now shelter had to become a vehicle for structural safety, rather than private retribution. The foundation's work took us into neighborhoods that did not know our names. We funded legal clinics, trained public defenders in the nuances of protective orders, and set up grant programs that paid for security that was accountable to law and to the rights of the people it served. The moral difference between buying quiet and building systems was one I repeated like a chorus. Protection requires public instruments, not private power. Months passed, and the wounds that had once smelled of smoke faded into stories. The man who had been shot recovered but bore the scar as a permanent record. His life moved forward under the legal umbrella that he and the state had constructed together. Dante completed the terms of his plea. He attended anger management programs, participated in mediated sessions where he spoke about his grief without excusing harm, and handed over documents that helped the DA identify other instances where his operatives had acted outside the law. None of that erased what had occurred. It made it less likely to be repeated in the same way. I watched him change in small ways. He learned to ask before deciding. He gave up certain unilateral methods of surveillance and accepted audits. When he visited the Foundation's offices, he sat in the back and listened. I heard him once say in a staff meeting, out of hearing of the reporters, that his mother's death had made him think in absolutes, that he had never been taught to trust institutions to do the heavy lifting. That admission was small and potent, a man acknowledging that his isolation had been a crucible for dangerous habits. There were relapses, arguments about thresholds and old instincts, but they were addressed in public structures rather than whispered away. Marco struggled too at times. He missed the immediate clarity of a man in the field issuing commands. He had to learn patience. He took a job consulting with non-profits on how to staff safe houses without turning them into private fortresses. Rosa, who had never sought the limelight, found herself a public voice on the ethics committee, her knuckles freckled by work, her hands steady as ever. A year after the night at the curb, the Foundation held its first major fundraiser, more ceremony than necessity, an evening meant to signal to donors and to the public that our work had legs. The ballroom was less an instrument of social performance and more a signal. We had created an institution that could be accountable, that required legal oversight, that acknowledged the tension between safety and freedom. I wore a gown that made sense for the room without performing apology. Dante attended as an invited but not center stage guest. He had agreed to the terms in our private contract. No theatrics, no attempts to control the perimeter of the event. Outside, it rained in a way that seemed to mirror that night long ago, though this rain felt thinner and less decisive. Photographers milled, their lenses hungry for composition. I went out under an umbrella with Dante at my side. No one had to know we were together. The cameras would find us anyway. We walked toward the car, slowly, deliberately, because both of us understood the optics. When we reached the curb, a photographer lifted his lens and captured the frame. We didn't pose like lovers in a novel. We did not arrange our hands or preen. We left by choice. We left because we had chosen to be photographed. We walked together for reasons both private and public, because the Foundation's visibility mattered, because the alternative, separate exits construed as estrangement, was a lie I would not live. The image that went up the next morning was tidy in a way the event had not been. Two people exiting under umbrellas. The headlines had a field day with innuendo, but the photograph did not tell the full story. What it could not show was the ceremony that came later that evening in a small private room at my home. It was not an event. It was a quiet recognition. Dante handed me a small envelope. Inside was the battered brass key he had given me the first week. He had cleaned it and rubbed the metal until it gleamed with an awkward tenderness. Beside it was another key, smaller and shorn of sentiment, a key to a safety deposit box that would hold records and funds for the Foundation under dual custody. "This is not a promise of possession," he said. "It is an agreement. I put these into the trust we created. The board has 2 signatures, yours and an independent trustee's." I touched the cold metal and felt, improbably, not relief but the steadying force of a covenant made legal. I placed the key back around my neck, not as a mark of ownership, but as an acknowledgement that I had chosen, and would continue to choose, how to be protected. We did not end the night with vows or a pledge of forever. We ended with a conversation about contingency plans and visitation schedules and the things people with complex lives must negotiate if they intend to remain present to one another without consuming each other. He listened. I continued to insist upon audits and independent counsel. He agreed. The key at my throat was my shorthand for consent given and consent revocable. There are no cinematic endings to such bargains, only everyday maintenance. Years later, the Foundation is still in work. We fund programs that teach people the difference between safety that isolates and safety that liberates. We advocate for laws that require transparency in places where private power has too long reigned. Rosa still bakes the cakes for our small dinners. Marco trains men and women in lawful perimeter management that centers de-escalation. Dante sits on a hospital board that provides care for victims of violence. He has not been made into a saint by any public process. He has, however, been made to answer for the ledger of his past. People sometimes ask me if I regret that night at the curb, whether the desire that began with a practical choice ever felt like a trap. They ask as if human life were a moral multiple-choice test, where the correct answer is obvious. The truth is naughty. I went for the lights that night because that was the simplest truth I could tell myself. I left with a man because I calculated the risk. I accepted shelter because I wanted shelter. Those choices bore consequences I could not have fully imagined. But I also found in the weeks that followed the capacity to turn a narrow survival instinct into public work. I insisted on being more than a client of private protection. I demanded institutions that would obey law and respect autonomy. I made sure that if men like Dante wished to help, they would have to do so under rules that protected the vulnerable, rather than consuming them. The key I wear is both weight and reminder. It is not a talisman that guarantees safety. It is a daily prompt that I made choices, and that those choices must be tested by institutions and by my own continued vigilance. Desire is not a spoiler of judgment. It is a human thing that complicates decisions. What makes desire ethical is the willingness to put one's actions under scrutiny, to accept legal consequence, and to do work that transforms private power into public protection. If the tabloids want a tidy narrative, they will try to write one, from dinner to desire to redemption. The reality is more complicated. It is ledger and law, tenderness and tests, public consequence, and private repair. There is no single tidy ending, because life, especially the life that happens behind the masks of socialite galas and hedgerow estates, resists tidy conclusions. On the anniversary of that night, we stood under umbrellas, photographed by the same lenses that had once wanted a scandal. We walked out by mutual choice. The cameras caught the angle of our shoulders, and not the contract between us. I pressed the key against my palm before getting into the car, not as an offering, but as a check. I had agency, I had insisted upon it, and I would continue to insist upon it. That, more than any photograph, is the point I continue to insist on. If you want more stories that live in those uncomfortable grays, where desire and duty collide, explore more long-form narratives on the channel.